Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. For as little as $3 you can gain access to patron only episodes as well as access to our Discord server where we host weekly live discussions with host Ikoi Hero and myself. So if you like what you hear, come join us at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. This week, psychotherapist Harriet Fraad and substance abuse counsellor Ikoi Hero talk with returning guest Bethany Morris about her work surrounding borderline personality disorder. Bethany is an assistant professor of psychology at Point Park University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where she teaches and does theoretical and qualitative research. Dr. Morris is a transdisciplinary scholar whose work bridges critical psychology, literature, philosophy, history, psychoanalysis, and film studies.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
The simplest definition would be that borderline personality disorder is a chronic condition that is marked by emotional dysregulation, mood instability, which results in difficulty with personal relationships, intimacy, and has a high rate of suicidal ideation behavior and self-harm.
The sort of interesting thing is, in reading Bethany's work, the observation that it's massively ratioed towards women being given this diagnosis and not men. So that's kind of the first bit of the puzzle piece, I guess, is that it's kind of a curious thing. And the symptoms, I think the damning bit in particular in the paper was that the symptoms that are problematic when women exhibit them are not a problem when men do. So what exactly is sort of going on with this description? Why are women being pathologized or sort of being seen as too much when men aren't?
So I think, some of the symptoms that you're talking about is they have one of the criteria is impulsive and self-destructive behaviors. And in the DSM, they give a list of what that could mean. And, they talk about binge eating, promiscuity, heavy drinking, reckless driving. I'm trying to think what the other one is. Something to do with spending, like reckless spending. And I remember the first time I read that, I was like, that just sounds like Super Bowl Sunday to me. Like a bunch of guys sitting around drinking and eating and, I guess I shouldn't say that, but representations of sort of a youthful masculinity, right? And I'm like, why is it a problem when women do this? And in particular, the qualifier of promiscuity as being excessive, right? Because I was reading a lot of Naomi Wolf's work at the time, and thinking about the double standard around sexuality and sexual behavior for men and women. And so that's kind of what really drew me in, is like, why is this excessive for women, and maybe men are slipping under the radar? So 75% of borderline cases were women at the time. The current DSM has claimed to have fixed that. I don't know how that was fixed. I don't know what happened to all those women that were diagnosed. And it also sort of assumes yes, that we've just gotten rid of our gender disparity, and all these clinicians that have been trained with these sort of maybe implicit biases in the diagnostic criteria, they're cured now, right? They don't have that gender bias anymore now. So I'm a little suspicious of that.
Right. I mean, one of the things that's been said, and I don't know how, I've never really looked into the the numbers behind, people stating this, but I've heard a lot of people say, like, in terms of that cluster of diagnosis, right, that, the men get diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, and women get diagnosed with borderline.
Yeah, and I think antisocial personality disorder too is like
as well
more often men. Yeah.
So one of the questions from Elle was that it's talked about very often that BPD is a gender diagnosis. Are there any other categories like race or class that impact the likelihood of a BPD diagnosis?
That's not something that I am aware of. I know I've done a little bit of research on other diagnoses that have seems like a racial discrepancy, like with schizophrenia, for example. But with borderline, I am not entirely sure if there is a racial component. I wouldn't be surprised if there was, because one of the criteria is, which I just love, because is excessive anger. And I say love in a sort of derisive manner, that a clinician is going to evaluate whether or not your anger was excessive or not. It just seems a little bit strange to me. But given the ways in which women of color have been assumed to be more angry, right, and excessively angry, I wouldn't be surprised if I saw a higher ratio of women of color, but I don't know the statistic off the top of my head.
I've also heard borderline and histrionic applied a lot more towards gay men. And again, I don't know the numbers behind it, but I've just seen, like, whenever I've seen men that were diagnosed, were known that were men that were diagnosed with like histrionic borderline, I have yet to meet a straight man. It's generally been gay men. On the flip side, like, the lesbian women that I've come across have sometimes, like, I've seen more lesbian women that have been diagnosed with narcissistic over borderline.
Yeah, and I wonder to what extent too that a lot of it is assumptions about what is and what constitutes and who gets to demonstrate like more feminine behavior, right? And the biases that are implicit in that. Yeah.
Right, and that's a key thing, because in one of your papers you point out that many therapists talk about the difficulty in treating borderline patients because of the patient's inconsistencies and contradictory behaviour. But you have a sort of reinterpretation of that sort of framing, which I think sort of fits with the point you just raised about like having sort of excess anger.
Yeah, I think this is sort of the thing that I noticed that really sparked my interest in borderline in the first place. Ever since I was in like undergraduate psych classes, I've been hearing clinicians and primarily male clinicians complain about, working with borderline clients. And when I started reading about it, I actually saw that this was in the actual literature too, that clinicians are advising other clinicians that, borderline clients refuse to respect boundaries, and they're really difficult to work with because they'll behave one day one way and then completely different on another. They'll take their frustrations out on you. They'll take their anger out on you, which has already been denoted as excessive, right? But then the next day they might try to seduce you. And I don't think that these clinicians must all be inherently misogynistic or anything sort of simplistic like that. I do think it is probably very, very difficult to work with people who behave inconsistently when you believe that human beings are naturally consistent or stable, or with a client who attempts to seduce you if you don't have a sufficient understanding of like erotic transference, for example. So as an alternative, I think it's not even an alternative, it's just a return to some of the philosophical or theoretical underpinnings that have started psychology in the first place. I think ultimately the problem is we've sort of failed to conceptualize what the human subject is in psychology. It's now we think of it more as like an object that's supposed to fall on a spectrum of certain traits, and then clinicians are being sent out into the world unprepared to really confront the complexity of human experience and desire that Freud was wrestling with, that the Greeks were wrestling with, right? We've just sort of like annexed all of that to philosophy or a chapter in intro psych textbooks, and have stopped wrestling with it in our actual understandings of psychopathology.
Yeah. Yeah, it's huge. And the key phrase I liked in the paper was, in refusing to acknowledge the authority of the therapist. I think that's the key thing, right? That there is a sort of element of power imbalance that exists sometimes in that relationship. And that by, as you said, like there's an assumption that human beings are just consistent, and that you can put people in boxes, and that there's something inherently sort of rebellious, some part of sort of a rebellious spirit that refuses to be labeled in this way, or expected to behave in a certain way, and that the problem is all on that person, opposed to the lens in which people are viewed through.
As somebody that has worked with clients, that have had the borderline diagnosis, I've personally not found them any more difficult in some ways, in that there's this expectation that what we see as consistency is, filtered through our lens of consistency, rather than looking at what is consistent with this particular individual. From a counselor's point of view, I'm trying to figure out this person's specific consistency.
But are you the kind of therapist that gets given the BPD clients? Because again, from what I understand, that often happens, that there's people that are given this label and then are given to certain therapists who can deal with it better.
Right. Well, and again, that just comes from having a less rigid view of what is consistent, I guess. Right. Like, when I meet somebody, it's like, okay, like if I know your triggers, if I know what is upsetting to you, right, then it gives me a framework of how to work with a client, rather than this expectation of, I want you to behave in this specific way. Right. So what is predictable, and consistent is kind of sometimes, I guess, contradictory in a lot of therapy, in that I think a lot of times therapists kind of impose what they desire out of their clients, rather than looking at a pattern of behavior that exists in front of them and working with that.
Right, because presumably the BPD diagnosis is ultimately, it is identifying something, right, in terms of symptoms. But
right.
The categorization of being labeled with BPD presumably has some kind of stigma attached to it, or B, this is actually sort of relates to one of Elle's questions from the patron. In what ways does it serve a patient to receive this diagnosis, as far as access to treatment, options, assistance, resources, etc.? And I guess the other question to that would be, in what ways does it harm someone?
Yeah, I think that's an important question that I was maybe naive to in my early days of, dismantling psychiatry and my critique, that, at the end of the day, you still have people who are suffering. And what do you do with suffering? And as much as I would like a different system, we are operating under a certain system that recognizes human personality as something that is like either normal or abnormal, right? And so if a person is struggling, I think a label can absolutely help them fit into or get resources in a system that demands they adhere to that type of knowledge. At the same time, I think that type of knowledge, that in which you are classified as a set of symptoms rather than as what you're saying, Ikoi, the characteristic ways of relating to self and other, that I understand as like an adaptation, right? Like an ego adaptation. Rather than understanding it that way, you're sort of trapped in this prefigured knowledge about yourself, and it can be really hard to wrestle against that or think outside of that. And so everything gets filtered through that lens. And so I hear a lot now, like, well, this is because I'm borderline, as opposed to this is because I'm a human being who wants love in a certain way, and this is only how I recognize it, for example.
Right. I mean, a lot of what gets seen is borderline and, lack of consistency or lack of predictability. I think, like, take an example of a borderline client that, I worked with. Right, like a lot of other counselors were like, she flies off the handle. She's so unpredictable, and I was just like, I don't understand why people say this. Like, for example, like if I know that she's meeting up with her mother, who she has an extremely difficult and contentious relationship with, I know she's going to have a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's predictable. That's not unpredictable at all. If she's meeting with certain people, I know that with other people, it's kind of a 50-50 chance, depends on how that meeting goes. If you, again, like it's looking at, pre-existing patterns of relationships with people and how they respond to the people, it's actually highly, highly predictable. Right. Is the thing is like, it's like, okay, like, does she have extensive emotional dysregulation after these events?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yes. But again, this is somebody that's very, very upset. You don't generally expect, great emotional regulation out of people that are extremely upset.
Sure, and even just to go off that, that the idea that borderline people with borderline often have difficult relationships with their primary caregivers, usually their mother, right? And so the fact that they've learned a sort of relational style that they then carry into other relationships, that's not like out of the norm, right? That is highly predictable, to understand that somebody has learned behavior from another person and are now carrying that forward. That's what we all do, right?
I mean, ultimately, a lot of times, or at least how I've kind of explained, borderline to a lot of my clients when we've talked about it, is, basically it's like, yeah, like it seems like you haven't had an experience or a space where you could practice really good relational behavior in your family,
Mm-hmm.
usually. So it's not, this isn't who you are, but like you just haven't had, the ability, because of a lack of people around you that could help you practice these skills.
And is that what therapists find challenging? Is because that then they get rattled by that XYZ person isn't playing by the usual rules of interaction?
I think a lot of people, our entire structure of society is kind of structured around compliance. And in a lot of spaces, whether it's school, whether it's therapy, compliance is a huge marker of like a good student, a good client. So I think anyone that has any kind of oppositional behavior is often just, skirted into like the bad category. It's a default in many ways. And I think, it's one of the things of how much, for example, in treatment spaces, like compliance is, seen as like the mark of a good client, rather than, and I think that's kind of wrong.
But isn't this where the female thing comes in the sense that if you are oppositional and considered dysregulated, that this is where it weighs on females being diagnosed this way, whereas would it be typical a male behavior to just sort of be oppositional? And then I guess, part of the stuff that's really interesting in some of the stuff that you've written, Bethany, is just this idea that there is something kind of radical bubbling below the surface of all of this stuff. And I guess maybe it's a language thing as well. I'm not quite sure what the right terms are, because as you've mentioned, Ikoi, about either gay men being given this, or it's the feminine aspect that is sort of attached to this idea of being excessive in some manner. I mean, what does that? How do you see that in terms of like where that could lead to? Because one way of reading it is like, oh, there's this sort of revolutionary potential in the feminine, and we need to sort of break out of these particular ways of defining people, because, as you said, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that are happening about what a human being is or how they should be. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm forming a brilliant question here. I'm sort of riffing it opposed to being on script.
That's fine. I think I can follow something there if you allow me. When I think of contemporary psychology and psychiatry, I think of it as a very logic oriented body of knowledge, right? Like it wants to be a scientific paradigm. It wants to label and identify and control the behaviors that it's claiming to assess, right? And I follow a lot of the French feminists in this regard, that this is a sort of like phallic way of thinking. This is a very patriarchal way of thinking, that it's all rationality and there's no room for emotionality. And because of that, emotions are inherently excessive, right? And anything that is excessive, or anything that challenges the status quo, must be understood through the knowledge of the time, right? And this is why I like Freud as much as I do, because at the time he was giving space for the irrational, right? For the stuff that doesn't make sense. Whereas now we're like trying to fit it into our MRIs, and we have to know it. And can't let it be something that is inherently disruptive, and so this is how I'm thinking of the feminine, is anything that is excluded from sort of a phallic, rational, orderly, obsessive body of knowledge that we try so hard to to figure out, like with borderline, right? But it is essentially disturbing. So if you, like I said, if you are sitting across from a client who is behaving in ways that contradict what you think a human being is, because you think a human being is strictly conscious and rational, then you're going to try and understand them through that lens, and you're always going to have this little bit of excessive quality that doesn't get quite captured in your formulation. Turning to the borderline diagnosis, or the term, provides comfort for the person who is disturbed. And sometimes that is the person who is labeled as well, right? But ultimately, it's like knowledge. I mean, the very nature of knowledge is for it to fail, right? We haven't reached the capital T truth of our times yet, or we would all Elon Musk would be obsolete. We would stop science, everything, right? We need knowledge to fail. And that's, when we're using that against human beings, that's where things get a little bit tricky, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I just wanted to, I do have a couple of questions here from the patrons, but I just wanted to ask about, you have this reference to Uren. Is that how you say the person's name? The dominant tenets of capitalism are implicitly reflected in the assumptions and practices of psychiatry. Perhaps this has already been covered, but could you sort of elaborate on what that means?
Yeah, sure. So there's been a turn recently towards a critical psychology, right? Where it's looking at how psychology and psychiatry may be a product of capitalism, the way that might reinforce capitalist practices. But I think that much of the problem with contemporary psychology and psychiatry is, like I said earlier, that it's been divorced from philosophy and the human sciences so much that it no longer actually refers to a human subject, but rather like a collection of traits. And so
it's very compartmentalized.
Yeah, and objectified, right? We've stopped asking about, like, what does it mean to be a human being? And in doing this, we've essentially asked the human being to stop being what it is, which is contradictory, desiring. It's a meaning-making system animal, right? And we've instead come to assume that, like, the human subject fits into these categories, like you're saying, and confirm the tests that we give it, and either respond or fail to respond to the interventions that we give. And of course, any failure to respond to these interventions is on the part of the subject, of the human being. And so psychiatry and psychology have sort of commodified subjectivity. Yeah, we've sort of taken ourselves as a product, right?
Yeah. Commodified subjectivity is a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and I mean, you see this, right? Like, now there's a ton of apps that you can always be working on yourself in order to fit in with society, right? To fit in with the demands of our time, which to some extent has always been the case because we've always lived under some sort of social contract. But now, what's really interesting is that not fitting in also fits in, because there's a therapy, there's an app, there's a drug that you can take, and you can also come to know yourself strictly through your diagnosis, right? Your diagnosis becomes a commodity as well. And in doing this, we sort of lose the question of our own desire, our own experiences, our own meaning making, and just kind of learn to exist within the free market.
There's this kind of, demand of I guess the ideal person in society being this, always rational, always reasonable, perfectly regulated at all times. Kind of ideal in society, which is inherently extremely inhumane. Those kinds of, ideals are what some of these diagnoses are kind of judged under, so we have this very, very inhumane ideal that is, where these diagnoses are born out of, because to a certain degree, there is an extreme reason in borderline, right? Which is that, like, there is, I am upset and I am expressing my upset, which is what is, to a certain degree, there is a sign of health there.
Yep, there's a boundary that there's something that they're trying to protect, or they feel something is under threat and they're not going to take it.
Right, so I've always been, like, a lot concerned with, like, people who have been kind of, like, defeated and beaten down to the point where, they don't have these reactions, right? Because, I mean, it's just somebody telling you in a certain sense, like, I'm very upset about something is very wrong, is a lot of what gets pegged as, like, unreasonable in borderline a lot of times.
I think that's really important, that, we understand personality, behaviors, as a strategy of a way of relating to others, as opposed to just, like, evidence of pathology, right? It's more humane to think of it as a strategy, a coping, that we all have. Like, there's not one of us has, like, a normal personality, right? We've all come up with something that is unique to us, that helps us adapt to other people's demands and our own desires. And we could call that pathology, but there is no normal referent, there is no ideal person.
Yeah. And Harriet has joined. There's some questions here from patrons. I'm just going to ask this one, and then we should jump in with some of your questions, Harriet. Elle had asked, do you have any thoughts on Dr. Marsha Linehan's biological theory? Long story short, BPD is an interaction between a biological inclination to emotional vulnerability and social hardships.
I don't know the theory. My orientation towards biological explanations in general is that you still need someone interpreting the body, right? You still need someone interpreting the biological. So it's always going to get filtered through the human subject. And so I think it can provide a lot of interesting context, but as experiencing, meaning-making animals, we don't live as a biological animal, if that makes sense. Like, we don't live thinking about our genetics and neurotransmitters. We live according to the emotions that rise, the thoughts that pop up in our minds out of nowhere. So it's always an interesting component to me, but I would always be more drawn to how the person is making sense of the biology as opposed to the biology itself, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Very good sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. Harriet, did you have any sort of questions you were sort of itching to ask before I?
Well, the first one, I suppose, Bethany, and hello, Bethany. I suppose you have already responded to let our audience know what you mean by the terms phallic and phallus and symbolic, because not everyone is up to date on Lacan and others that use those terms.
Yeah, I mentioned it, but I don't think I really adequately explained it, because they are terms that get thrown around. And so Lacan uses the term phallic to talk about words, signifiers, but he takes this from Freud, right? So Freud talking about penis envy and the status of the penis in child development. And Lacan basically takes a lot of that and makes it metaphorical. So the way that I teach something like penis envy, for example, is not to say, yes, girls, they realize they don't have a penis, and then they live the rest of their life wanting a penis, right, until they get to have a baby boy, and look, because that's what Freud said, right? But to make it more metaphorical and to think, okay, in our contemporary society, there are certain bodies that have been privileged over other bodies. And when we look at those bodies and see difference, we attribute the privilege to that difference. And so this is what Lacan says with the phallus as opposed to the penis, right? That there is sort of like a phallic power that, or male privilege, we could say, right? That comes with certain types of experience. And so when I teach penis envy, I say like wage equality, for example. Why is it that that women still do not make as much money as men? Like, right? And of course we want to, because the difference is arbitrary. Like, if we're doing the same work, right? And so it's this signifier, this symbol of difference that comes with privilege. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, it does make sense. And I had questions because I think the United States is in transition. Right now, more people want to have a girl rather than a boy, and males are in far greater trouble. And because they don't get family wages to support dependent, subservient women and children anymore, the majority of males, and most managers are now women because a manager doesn't need aggression as much as negotiation. And I mean, I have found, as a mother of a girl and a boy, my daughter she had a herniated navel, so she thought she had both organs and was very proud of that. And she used to say to my son, "Too bad you have no vagina." Ha 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 ha. And my son was quite upset about that, not having that equipment and not having both. Now, partly they were raised in a feminist household, even if it's a sexist culture. And they were studiously exposed to feminist literature and feminist children's books and that kind of thing. But I wonder, I think that the symbolic, if it's like language, it has been inflected in modern feminism to express us in a way that we haven't been acknowledged before and has been feminized in that respect. And so that at least there are many, many people in the United States that see the male gender stereotype as a terrible privation of emotional connection and emotional vulnerability, and see men as rather deprived. And since every day in the US, there's a mass murder, at least one, there have been more than one a day thus far in 2022, and they're all men. There's an increasing perception that having only aggression as an outlet is terribly limiting to half the population. So I see the social attitudes changing based on, in part, on the conditions of economic existence in the society, that 42% of mothers are single mothers, and that although we get paid less, and mothers are paid even less than other women, but there is a change. Do you see that sea change?
So there's a lot to address there. I would say there's definitely things changing. Now, is it changing away from a phallic economy? I don't think so, because from a Lacanian perspective on this, like with where it's not the literal penis, it's, you said it perfectly, you like either having or not having, right? And so things are changing now where I think more women are being constituted as having something, but that is still inherently phallic, and it always is premised on those who do not have something. And so I think a lot of the issues we're seeing around masculinity right now are what Freud would call castration anxiety, like or more so Lacan's castration anxiety of the thing that they didn't have in the first place is being taken away from them, right? And that is an existential threat. And so I still see it as a phallic economy, which is going to have its own problems and its own benefits. But as far as it being feminized or a sort of feminine socius, I would say, well, no, and it can't be, because the feminine, we sort of talked about this a little bit, is everything that is excluded, that can't be named, that can't be said, that doesn't fit within the symbolic. And so there are some great French feminists who have written in this tradition, right? Nicole Brizard and Helen Cixous, where they're really challenging to read because they refuse to use like signification.
Right.
But yeah, so I would say there's definite change, but it's still maybe inherently premised on this having or not having.
Well, the other question, I'm sorry.
So Harriet, like this idea that people want girls instead of boys is because the sort of economic environment, women are doing better than men, and the sort of social thing. Is that what you were saying? Right.
Yeah, that men are really much more messed up in the US now because women don't want men who can't support them. So that eliminates about half of men. And therefore, men whose primary emotional life depended on having a woman in order to be male and still have an emotional life, and who depended on women not only for emotional connection, but on social connection with their children and their relatives and a lot of their friends. They are bereft in a way that women are not, because when men and women split up, men lose half of their humanity often. There's a country song, "You've been thinking and I've been drinking." I mean, you've been thinking about maybe you don't want me and I'm trying to blot myself out. That at the same time, there are these, make my day, I'll shoot you in the face kind of masculinities in our culture. There's also an increasing awareness that women are recreating ourselves through the symbolic and vaginalizing it, if you want to call it that, and making it ours. And men's dominance, based as it is in the sexism of our capitalism, dividing us by genders and races and everything else, is starting to wane. So I do see a change to a more vaginal awareness than a phallic one, that we have something rather than we're missing it.
From a British perspective here, how does Margaret Thatcher or Theresa May fit into any of this? Because they're not like, in reading some of this stuff about BPD and with, this idea that the feminine cannot be contained, right? Like that it has this potential to upset the status quo. When I look at those, these women who were in the spotlight, who had a lot of power, they were representations of the status quo, and with great force. Like in many ways, Thatcher's like the meanest. That sort of like dumb idea of like, if all the people in power were women, we'd have a nicer world. It's like, that's certain that doesn't track in Britain. But I mean, am I being sort of reductive in how I'm thinking, in sort of what I'm saying? Like, I'd be interested to hear if anything relates to that.
Yeah. I really don't think that there has to be like a biological essentialism when we're thinking of this, right? That women are feminine and men, right? And that, so you can have a character like Thatcher who is extremely phallic, right? She's an extremely masculine person, right? And so I don't know. I would still say that I see a lot of the contemporary tenets of the tenets of contemporary feminism as being still pretty phallic, in that there is an assertion, like it's still tied to capital. It's still tied to, not all tenets. I shouldn't generalize like that, but that a lot of what we're considering to be what's the word I'm looking for? Success is still tied to capital, which is still based on the presence of something. So power, money, accumulation of wealth, and
girl boss.
Lean in, right?
Right.
Yeah, right. Except, and here we're talking about those top feminists like Sheryl Sandberg, who wrote Lean In, said women can do it all, but she didn't mention that she had 9 servants helping it out. That there is a corporate feminism that claims to be tied to feminism, but is actually tied to hiring other women to do all the domestic labor for which you were held responsible and not paid.
Which all that stuff is still derided, like caretaking, right, is still considered less than.
Yes, it is. Just Jacinda Ardern, though, in New Zealand, has just raised caregiving roles 30.5% in a just move that has changed the face of labor in New Zealand. But she is alone in that, and she's an amazing feminist leader. and not at all the Margaret Thatcher, who I just have to add, I have a British friend who always insisted Thatcher was a man in drag.
Right.
She
Well,
wasn't.
that's not, but even if that was the case, it's like, is that a pin-up for that community? I don't think so. I mean, again, there's plenty of people that absolutely love Thatcher in this country, and I guess she's created an environment where some people made a lot of money.
Yes, she did. She did.
But just to just ask one other question. You wrote quite a bit about liminal spaces, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that and how that fits with your thinking around BPD, and maybe how it reframes acts of self-harm.
Yeah, so liminal spaces is an idea that I've taken from French philosophers Deleuze and Guattari, and I'll say I'm a little bit distant from them now. I have since married a psychoanalyst, right? So the philosophy got married with the practical, and like hearing about actual suffering. And so sometimes I look back at my old work and I'm like, ooh, I romanticize like radical suffering a little bit too much there. And so I want to just have that as a bit of a disclaimer. But now I can sort of think about understanding like liminal spaces as those spaces in between coexisting ways of being, or knowledge in which something else can occur that relies on some form of creativity or experimentation, like to get out of the deadlock. So we can think about like when we get in relationships with people, sometimes it's just repetition compulsion, we're just doing the same thing. And every once in a while, someone says or does something different that opens up a gap where something new can occur. So that's how I understand the liminal space. And with borderline, because of the issues with self-harm, often, on the skin, and the identity disturbances, I think that this liminal space is really the gap that emerges between like the self and the other that the borderline disturbs. So whether it be their partner or the therapist. And I think I talked about this before, like in last time I was on, we really want to think of ourselves as individuals and kind of unto ourselves, but we're always already constituted by another, right? Specifically, the one that brought us into language, that named us, and the one that delighted in our speaking or refused to acknowledge us, or whatever reaction they had, right? And so the skin, and when I'm thinking about self-harm, the skin functions as a sort of mistaken container of subjectivity that says, okay, this is where I am, and that's where you are. And with borderline, self-harm may be seen as a bit of a creative, and I don't want to romanticize that notion, but an alternative response to communicating stress about the intrusion of this other, that may allow for some like resistance or separation from that other. The problem, as I see it, is that this often then gets interpreted for the person by the clinician or the therapist or the partner, and it's often deemed as just a cry for help, rather than it being like a really meaningful act on the part of the person doing it in the first place.
I also wanted to say that as a clinician who's been in practice for at least 45 years, I've worked with a lot of people labeled borderline, although I hate those labels and I think they pigeonhole people into a disease model, which I totally reject. Nonetheless, I have found that they all share growing up in a totally dichotomized world. A lot of them are people from very religious families, so that their acts are either of God or of the devil, in a dualistic juxtaposition that is terribly damaging. And so the all good, all bad is an extension of the way they were brought up, and they can undo those by talking about them and considering them instead of accepting them as the world. And they've all gotten improvement with no drugs. Because I do think a dichotomized worldview encourages bipolar behavior.
On the topic of self-harm, one of the interesting one, I have a friend that has had a long history of it, and the way that he described his self-harm behavior was that it actually allowed, it was a way, because a lot of times he was, he would talk about how he would just kind of get completely consumed in thought, in trying to like interpret what's going on with his life, why he was feeling this way, why he was acting this way. And, the cutting was what grounded him, like, oh, I'm still here.
Mm-hmm. I can still feel too.
Right. Like I can, I'm still here. And this is, so it was, for him, it was just kind of like a mechanism of like, not kind of like spinning out into his mind completely and just kind of like grounding himself. Oh yeah, I'm still here. So like he was just like, actually like one of the things that really kind of upset him was that people were like, he was like, no, like this is actually a kind of a sign of health for me.
Mm-hmm.
Not romanticizing the behavior, but like, if I stop cutting, that's when you have to really get worried about me.
Right. That makes great sense to me.
That if this is if I'm still doing this, I'm, and he was like, eventually, learn to other coping mechanisms of no longer having to do this as he grew older. But, another thing that he said that was very, very interesting with, he was just like, the funny thing is that like I started football, right? And the pains of football, like when I was playing football, I didn't need to cut.
Right, because he was hurt all the time.
And then I got injured and I was no longer able to play football in the early part of high school. And after that is when I started cutting to ground myself. He's just like, yeah, like a lot of cutting is also seen as feminine behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That it is geared a lot more, the focus often is a lot more towards the feminine. But he was just like, just from like years in like, therapy and rehab and group therapy and whatnot, he was just like, I think a lot of the quote unquote like cutting drive is kind of removed from a lot of men in some of the painful competitive sports.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Because I was thinking like, pain is such a great way to remind oneself one has a body, right? We're so caught up in thinking all of the time that it's, you can be caught in a thought and then you stub your toe and you're like, oh, right, I'm this like pathetic animal for a second. But that, a lot of the time the cutting is because it's understood as a cry for help, and cry for help is theatrical, therefore it must be feminine, right? It kind of gets coded as that rather than understanding it as a way to become like embodied again. And so I think there's probably so many ways that we do that are like socially acceptable, like playing football, going to the gym, things like that, right? That remind us that we are like a corporeal being. And I think maybe sometimes it gets considered to be feminine because for a long time, women have had less say over what their body is and what it means, right? And this is what I was saying with this intrusion of this other, like this person who has more sort of more to say about your body than you can say about your body. Cutting can be a way of saying, this is where I begin, right?
Yes, and it does contradict a lot of the sexism in the therapeutic community. I also think it's interesting to note that one of the recent mass murderers, I've been studying mass murder lately, who killed 20 people, an 18-year-old, was obviously in trouble. He came to school with cuts all over his face. So he was trying to face his pain, I suppose. And when people asked, what happened to you? He said, proudly, I did it myself. And I guess it didn't give him the release he needed and the primacy he needed, so he shot 20 people. But it is a way of facing how hurt you are by seeing your own blood. I've had that in several cutting clients. The need to face that they're hurt.
And I wonder, too, if there's something there about masculinity versus femininity, right? The taking it out on the self versus having to take it out on others in order for it to be considered legitimate.
Yeah, well, women do tend to victimize ourselves.
One of the things that my friend said was that, like, his cutting wasn't seen as nearly as alarming as, like, the women in his program. It's one of those things where he was like, yeah, it's funny, you know, like I tell people I'm a former football player, and that I got injured, couldn't play anymore. And that was when my cutting started. And like suddenly, you know, people are just like, oh yeah, oh, I get it. Like you're just frustrated and whatever. Like it was kind of like minimized, where it was just like, well, like, I mean, that there is context to this, you know, but still, like, the reason I was cutting myself was because I was, you know, under significant emotional distress that football covered up, not football resolved. Versus like some of the women in my program talking about like how people responded to their cutting. And also just kind of like, you know, one of the things about how, like, because a lot of times when you're in residential program, you get put under behavioral contracts, right? So in most residential facilities of any time, you know, cutting is something that people are put under contract. Like, I won't do this while I'm in this program, or like, you know, if I feel a desire to do this, I will talk to a staff member, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And he was just saying like, oh yeah, like the speed that some women got put under a contract versus him, right? Because one of the things he was just like, yeah, like, you know, in a certain sense, like, you know, because he is talking about like a much younger version of himself, but he was already shaving at that time. He was just like, you know, some of the cutting I can actually cover up as, right, like a shaving accident.
Right.
Right. But it's also one of those things where he was like, you know, what was crazy to me was like that they would accept that out of me, a guy, right? But that they wouldn't accept the same thing that a woman would say if she was shaving her legs.
So why is the world scared of girls? Why is it like that when it's displayed like that, when it's a woman that does it, it's terrifying to an authority?
I think they're afraid. I think Bethany says it well, of being terrified. And I do think that in our early upbringing, which is a matriarchy in all of these cultures, the most powerful, dominating creatures, like the mothers, the daycare workers, the nurses, the babysitters, are all women, witnessing everyone at their most humiliating. That a lot of men feel that their reaction to that matriarchy is to be suspicious of women as dominating and evil. And since we are much more the body of the faithful instead of the head of the world, we take out on our bodies more of our pain. But I do think that there is this terrible hierarchy, and it's being mitigated now as the gender movements have made some changes. But as long as we have a capitalist society that defines money and power over rather than power with as the most important things to give you standing in the world, we will probably have this horrendous sexism as well, and there will be fewer women in leadership positions.
And this conversation continues on our Patreon. So why not join us over at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons: Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Justin Harper, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.